Tonight we'll be looking deep inside one of America's most powerful and controversial companies, Facebook. With a valuation of more than $546 billion and billions of users around the world, Facebook is a story of entrepreneurial pluck, breakneck growth, as well as enormous influence. Yet at the same time, the story has a dark side of fake news, interference in elections, addictive behaviors, and the mishandling of users' personal data. So questions. How did Facebook grow into the social media giant that it is today with more than 2.25 billion users daily? And at what cost and to whom? How did Mark Zuckerberg's vision to connect everyone become a tool also that divides us? Can or should Facebook be fixed? And what does our answer to that question reveal about us and our evolving relationship to technology? Based on hundreds of interviews, including those with Mark Zuckerberg, veteran tech journalist Stephen Levy has written this new book, Facebook, The Inside Story. We're very pleased to welcome Stephen back to the CHM stage, where he'll be in conversation with our president and CEO, Dana Lewin. Following our museum tradition, I'd like to introduce our speakers using 5 numbers. Stephen Levy, author, journalist, and Wired editor-at-large. 50, the biggest fee he was paid for performing at a coffee house as a folk singer in college. I'd like to hear you, Stephen. 1984, the year he published Hackers, wrote about Steve Jobs and Macintosh for Rolling Stone. 38 years reporting on technology. 8, the number of books authored, and 1,967 friends on Facebook. Dana Lewin, Silicon Valley tech executive and now museum leader. 1976, the year he came to Silicon Valley on a lost bet. 2, the number of times he was recruited by Steve Jobs. 97, the score out of 100 on Microsoft's Leadership Effectiveness Index that he was given by the other employees. 24 months now as heading up the museum here as president and CEO at CHM. And 1 time around the globe as equivalent number of miles he swam as a competitive swimmer. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Stephen Levy and Dana Lewin.
Yeah, everybody's doing it, right? All right. Well, thank you, Marguerite, and thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for coming out. There's a lot going on in the world these days, isn't there? The story and the topic tonight, I think, is prescient for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which was yesterday was the primary. So what I wanted to do in starting is just to acknowledge the fact that this particular moment for me and for the museum is really exciting. We, after 20 years, have evolved the mission of this institution to focus on, and I will state, decoding technology, its computing past, digital present, and future implications on humanity to shape a better future. And because this is really an opportunity for us to talk about the digital present, because in so many ways what you've done in this book is to articulate a framework for what really is sort of the life as we know it for so many people on this planet. So it's really an exciting time to think about that. And without that historical context, sometimes people can get lost. So I'm really excited to use this as really a moment for us to talk about this book, but also to put it in the context of what this institution is growing into in its new position. So thank you for your time on that, Stephen.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And it's always great to be back here at the Computer History Museum. I've had great times on the stage, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, it is really an exciting moment. So I'd like to start, because I think everyone here is familiar with Stephen's writings, by asking a little bit about the context on hackers. We're going to go back to 1984, which is essentially when we met, actually, because I was working at Apple then, and you were working on writing the article about Steve and Rolling Stone, et cetera. Is there any sort of thing you'd like to bring up in context? You took a stab at 25 years to discuss sort of Gates and Zuckerberg at Wired. So talk a little bit about the context on hackers and what's going on today.
Yeah, you mentioned in 1984, I wrote that article in Rolling Stone, was up there, and published Hackers. And 25 years after the book was published, we put out a new edition. And I wanted to talk to some of the people who I spoke to originally, who were in the book, and also some people who, if I were writing the book at that moment, in 1989, or 25 years later, like 2009.
Right,
2009. I would have spoken to for that book at that point. And Mark Zuckerberg was one of the first people that came to mind as someone, if I were starting a book about hackers in 2009, I would talk to him. And I wrote a new afterword for Hackers, and we ran it as an excerpt in Wired magazine, and got Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg to pose together for the cover.
Right.
And I hung out at that photo shoot. It was pretty interesting to watch the interaction between them. And I wanted to talk to Mark because what a hacker was, in some ways, was the same. And I was really struck when Facebook did its IPO in the S1, Zuckerberg wrote a little thing, a little section called The Hacker Way, that was pretty much lifted from Chapter 2 of Hackers.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Maybe that's why the IPO didn't do so well. But he had that hacker instinct. But what's happened since 1984 had been somehow hacking was not so opposed to getting rich.
Right.
So when I wrote the book, especially in the MIT hackers, they thought that it was above commerce, and making money was a little dirty from that. And the pivot was that you could be a hacker and also go through the process of venture capital and whatever, and be incredibly rich.
Right.
And that wasn't a contradiction.
Interesting. Were there any things that you gleaned from that first meeting? Is that the first time you met Mark?
No. I met Mark in 2006. I was working for Newsweek, and I was working on a story about what we were calling Web 2.0. I think I called it the living web in the cover story. And the companies we were looking at were MySpace, YouTube, which was independent at that time,
right,
and Flickr. Flickr, Stuart Butterfield and Katerina Fake were on the cover.
Right.
And I had heard that there was a really successful college website called Facebook, and with a really young founder, and I wanted to meet him. I thought maybe I'll get a quote from him and put it in the story. And it was right around the time of a conference called PC Forum,
right,
Esther Dyson's conference. And I saw that he was going to be speaking there. So I arranged a meeting with him. We would have lunch together. And during the lunch period, and you know how these things go, you go outside and there's big round tables and everyone scrambles for seats.
Right.
So we sat next to each other, and the employee accompanying him, his consigliere at the time, Matt Kohler, the guy's name was, who was now a venture capitalist.
Right.
He was a few years older than Mark. He was like all 28 maybe, and Mark was maybe 21 at the time. He couldn't get a seat next to me. He sat across the table. So I pitched Mark a few softballs. Like, how many colleges are you in? How many people do you have? And he just stared at me. And time passed.
Yeah.
He wasn't saying anything. And I'm thinking, what's going on here?
Right.
Is this some sort of episode? Is the blood clot explode in his brain? Or,
He wasn't rocking? No?
No rocking. No, that's a different guy.
Okay, different. Okay, just checking.
Yeah. And finally, I would ask him a couple more questions. He wasn't answering, or maybe grunting back. And I said, well, do you know anything about this conference we're at? And he said no. And I explained to him about the history of the conference, and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates used to come there in the 80s. And then he warmed up a little bit, but not too much.
Right.
And later, when I was doing this book, I came across, and we could talk about this, a notebook that he kept right around then.
Right.
The pages I got were dated, maybe just a few weeks after that. And I got a window into his head.
Right.
What he was thinking of when he was not talking to me was how he was going to remake Facebook from a college network to a network where everyone could use, and where the front page would be this stream, this feed of all the information about your friends, everything they shared, everything that happened to them. And those were the two big projects he was working on, as well as a wide vision for Facebook, where everyone in the world would have it, where the information it held would be on every person in the world. And this rich life was laid out in this little scroll. And so that was, I had like a number of experiences like that, where digging back into Facebook's path unfolded a new understanding of the company, which I feel is necessary to understand how they got to where they are today.
So this is in 2006?
Correct.
So 2006, he had penned sort of a future vision of the top line, surface level architecture of what Facebook would accomplish.
Right, right. He had to redo the architecture to open it up to everyone, because when it was colleges, each college was on a separate server. They were islands.
Right. Interesting. So were there things that you felt from that moment when he was staring at you that sort of led you to believe that he was sort of antisocial, or what was the? Because how many times did you?
I felt he had communication issues. Let me put it that way.
And how many times did you end up interviewing him in the process of this book, for example?
Well, in this book, I think I sat down. I think I wrote in the book, there was 7, and I came across a couple more, that were on the edge. So, it's probably 9 times I talked to him. But after that, I mean, between 2006 and 2007, the end of 2006, they did go wide to everyone. They did release the news feed. It was sort of a action-packed day, because a lot of the users didn't like it, and they organized a protest against it. And then in 2007, they introduced Facebook platform. They tried to be an operating system. And so I became increasingly interested in it. I know I hosted him on stage at a conference in the end of 2006, and talked to him in 2007, and we actually did a cover story for Newsweek in 2007.
That was the first F8 conference, roughly in 2007?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that was in the late spring of 2007, and by the summer, Facebook was so hot that we were competing with Time magazine to who's going to do the first cover.
Yeah, and roughly speaking,
we won, of course.
Of course, for you. The question of their user base at the time was something sub 20 million or around 20 million, if I recall.
But growing.
Yeah, for sure.
And they were pegged by them as the hottest thing. I think the platform took them up a notch. And people saw them as a serious company. And that's kind of ironic, because the platform is a source now of a lot of Facebook's woes. And for all the excitement it caused when they released it, and thousands and thousands of developers wrote for Facebook. They wrote on top of Facebook. But the thing ultimately was a bust, because people wound up writing their apps not for Facebook, but for mobile.
So what did you take away? There's some interesting things in the book about decisions that he made personally, early in his life, that are indicative of the way the company and the platform evolved. As you bring up the platform, I think that's important, because he certainly had a point of view that you really bring forward in the book about the conversations and negotiations with his family and his schooling and things like that. So maybe tell us a story about that.
There's one story in particular that stuck with me. And if you're writing a book about Facebook, it's got to be largely about Mark Zuckerberg. He is Facebook. And so I wanted to look into his early life. And it was interesting because the more I got into Facebook, I thought originally, gee, there's been a couple books that came out. One was a good book was out 10 years ago, was The Facebook Effect by David Kirkpatrick. There was a book which isn't quite as reliable. The movie was based on, and, but that was the early days. And I thought, that's kind of covered. I really don't have to spend too much time on that. But as Facebook suffered this period over the last 3 years, I realized to understand Facebook, you have to go back and re-examine those early days. And to me, it was even going back into Mark Zuckerberg's childhood to understand who he was. So I talked to his parents, and his mother told me a really interesting story. When he was in high school, he grew up in Westchester County in New York, and he went to the public school. And they didn't have enough computer courses for him. They didn't have enough AP classes to put him in good stead with the elite colleges he wanted to apply to. So he wanted to go to a private school. And his mother really wanted him to go to Horace Mann, which is an excellent school within commuting distance of where they lived. And he had heard that Phillips Exeter, which is a school up in New Hampshire that he'd have to board, had a good computer center. And the mother said, I really want you to go to Horace Mann. Your sister is leaving home that year to go to college. I don't want to lose 2 children. So please consider Horace Mann, at least interview with them. And he said to his mother, well, I'll interview with them, but I'm going to Exeter.
Right.
And he went to?
Exeter.
Exeter.
Yeah.
And I thought of that a lot in light of a lot of the decisions he made at Facebook. Mark, we should make this product opt-in instead of opt-out because it changes the privacy settings. And Exeter, guess what happened, right? The privacy settings were opt-out automatically. That they were changed in a way that wasn't as privacy friendly.
Right. Yeah, complicated when you look back at that. I do think there's some, as there was a historian we had on stage last week named David Kennedy from Stanford who made the comment that that history is an imperfect but indispensable guide to the future and the only mirror and measuring rod that we have for the present. So I think, your work and typically all of your writings have taken a deep look at the context from which current events occur. Were there any other things in his you write about them in terms of his interest in gaming and his interest in...
Sure, the games he played look interesting and sometimes ominous in retrospect. He loved Risk, which is a game you all know. It's a board with a map of the world, and you take over country by country. The winner is the conqueror, right? His favorite figure in history, he was kind of a fanboy of Augustus Caesar. Warm and fuzzy, right?
Right.
And he took Latin. He was a passionate Latin student.
Right.
He played a computer game, Civilization.
Right.
Again, a game where you pretty much conquer, I guess, the universe or whatever. And so these were his interests. And then eventually, not only did he play games, but he created his own worlds and
the system for it.
And mastered software.
Yeah, absolutely. So. Do you have a sense, now that the book is complete and under your belt, about what those triggers might have been that led him to, in 2006, have documented the surface structure? Because I think as we look back at some of these earlier things in his family life and just personal decisions that he made along the way, and then also the context at Harvard, where clearly he was on a mission to do something other than get a Harvard degree.
Right, well, clearly, yeah. And he loved to make these little projects, he called them. He had a project in Exeter with a fellow student called Synapse AI that was kind of a playlist software that supposedly used artificial intelligence to create your playlist. Kind of an embarrassing introduction, to it when he released it, about seducing a Chinese girl or something, that Paul D'Angelo, Adam D'Angelo, who was his co-founder, co-creator of the software. Adam later became the CTO of Facebook, and then Adam left and started Quora. But by his sophomore year, he was spending most of his time not going to classes, but sitting in the common room of his suite at Kirkland House, which is kind of the way Harvard refers to its dorms, building one project after another. One of them is the one that got him in trouble. The face mash thing was kind of a hot or not program.
Right.
In order to get people's pictures, he would break into and scrape the websites of various houses, the various other dorms of Harvard, and violated the rules of the institution, almost got thrown out. But there were other projects. One was to see what fellow students were in classes you might want to enroll in. So if you were thinking of going to a class and your friends were there, you might be more likely to enroll in the class, or someone you wanted to date might be in the class, and you could check that out.
Right.
So the thread for all these programs he was writing, it was something social.
Right.
Friendster was operating then, and he joined it just to learn about it.
Right.
And by February of that year, he had the Facebook.
Right. Yeah, that actually brings me to an interesting question. It's something I took away from reading the book, which is the sense, and I think it is safe. I don't think by any means are you picking on Mark in this book. You're really just describing the essence of what the company has become, which has been, based upon a vision and a motivation that he had to connect people. Clearly, people opt into institutions because there are greater implications of what an institution can accomplish than what an individual can accomplish. But there are all of the issues associated with the opt-in, opt-out, and the implications of what you give to be a member of a community and what you get in exchange for it. Large corporations oftentimes pay you well for those kinds of things. But when you join a social network, as this has been constructed, you're giving. The question is, what are you getting? And how do you think he saw that in the early creation of the system?
Well, in thinking about it, he did what you saw on the Macintosh. He built something he wanted to use himself.
Right.
So when he evaluated what was going to work in a social network based in a college, he thought about, gee, what do the people, my peers, really want? They want to know about what's going on with, in my circle. They want to know people who my friends know, so I can meet them.
Right.
So what friends do my friends have who I'd like to meet? And so it was a grazing area where everyone would upload information to their profiles. After the face mash episode, he learned that to be on the good side of Harvard in privacy, they're saying, bring your own. It was all user-generated content. People decided what they would upload to their profiles. There was a certain amount of privacy built in. For one thing, in order for people to see what was on there, they'd have to actually go to individual profiles. And the other is that your parents could never see it because it was limited to the people in the harvard.edu domain.
Right.
So he figured this was something that would enhance the college experience. Now later, more recently, he said, oh, I did it because we were all talking about Iraq at that time, the invasion of Iraq, and that's ridiculous. So, I mean, I've probably looked at every interview he's ever given about those ages. I've talked to people, his classmates, and everything. Not one person ever mentioned Iraq. I don't know where the heck that came from.
Right.
But, I don't think it was really until sometime around the time he was writing that notebook that he had that vision of this will be something to connect the world and start having ambitions, that were global and really coalesce into this Facebook mission to connect the world.
Right. So how do you think the earlier social media ideas and sites played into that, or do you think he had a vision that was far beyond that to begin with?
Well, he took the pieces that had come up. It was not the first social network.
Right.
Friendster was popular.
Right.
MySpace was out there.
Right.
A few years earlier, a lot of the founding ideas were in a product called 6 Degrees.
Right.
It was just too early, way ahead of its time.
Right.
So he used that grammar of social networks, that you choose to make connections, and the connections drive your experience there, and did it in a way where things clicked.
Mm-hmm. So you might draw the analogy from, say, Gates and/or Jobs going to Xerox PARC and seeing interesting things, and then going and building a new industry.
But it
it.
wasn't even that secret. You had to get into Xerox PARC and cut a deal. This was all out there.
Everywhere. It's all
out there.
Right.
And there was a I tell the story. There was a patent lurking in there. The 6 Degrees people had.
Yeah, you do right. Talk more about
Yeah.
that. I think that's a good point for people.
Yeah, the 6 Degrees people had a really valuable patent, and that company changed hands, and the patent came up for sale. And this was in around 2005, I think, and or maybe even later in 2004. It was after he moved to Palo Alto, and Reid Hoffman heard about the patent being up for sale, and he joined forces with Mark Pincus, the entrepreneur who later founded Zynga, and to buy that patent. And they both funded Friendster, but they did not offer a partnership to Jonathan Abrams, who was the head of Friendster, because they were worried that he was going to weaponize that patent. They wanted to get that patent so no one would use it against other companies.
Right.
And this was, to me, just one more example of what a charmed life Mark Zuckerberg led. I mean, that he didn't even know about it, but the patent that could have killed Facebook, could have smothered it in the cradle, was taken off the table as something that could threaten him.
Yeah.
And he didn't even know about it.
Interesting. That, it's particularly at that stage, because intellectual property in and around software, was sort of the beginnings of, with Amazon and one-click, and more software patents were starting to emerge. That does lead into the next set of questions that I think people would be really interested in, which is, really the startup conversation. There have been lots of questions I think people that have followed Facebook are curious about, relative to statements that I've read about, well, we could have built this in Cambridge, but they ended up in Silicon Valley.
Right.
And, how did the social network, quote unquote, in Silicon Valley help Facebook? In what ways do you think they, and Mark in particular, took advantage of the assets? And then I would, again, go back to this question of naivete. Was he naive, or was he really very smart about it? And you do call out Sean Parker in quite detail in the book as someone who learned a lot of lessons in the Valley and in the venture community, and played a really integral role early on. So maybe you talk a little bit about Mark and Sean.
Sure. Again, some happenstances happened that were incredibly fortunate for Zuckerberg and Facebook. They decided to spend the summer in Silicon Valley, and in part because one of his co-founders, a guy you never hear of, a guy named Andrew McCullum, he grew up in Sun Valley, I think, and got to know Bing Gordon from Electronic Arts, and they invited him to be an intern out here. So. And D'Angelo was an intern as well. So they took a house in Palo Alto and ran into Parker fortuitously, just on the street in Matadero. And Parker had heard about Facebook by accident. He looked over someone, he had gotten into hard times after Napster, and then a company called Plaxo that he got booted out of. And he was living in a student house with a bunch of kids, and happened to see Facebook and contacted Zuckerberg and met with him. But they fell out of contact. They ran into each other on the street, and Parker moved into their house. And Parker was sort of his guru into navigating the funding world of Silicon Valley. And some people came to think that Zuckerberg was really naive, and Parker did all the work and was the driving force. But someone else told me, it's kind of sly that this is something that Zuckerberg wasn't interested in, but he let Parker do the work and make the connections. And Parker knew Hoffman and Pincus, and they wound up arranging the famous meeting with Peter Thiel, where they got the original funding for Facebook.
Right. Yeah, fascinating, because at the end of the day, the network here fed the creation of the network in an interesting way. There's also a really interesting story that you call out in the book, because the major financing of the company, the sort of 10% ownership position that really was unusual. I think Facebook may have been the second or third, or I'm sure there were other companies, but beyond Google, really a control company with one person voting the shares. But there was this moment of consideration with the venture community, but also with Don Graham in the Washington Post. So maybe you'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting.
So that was particularly interesting to me because at the time that happened, I was working for Don Graham. I was at Newsweek, and Don Graham is the kind of person who knew all of his employees, thousands of employees. He'd know the names of everyone. And as the technology writer for Newsweek, sometimes I would come to his house. His mother would have parties, and Bill Gates would be there. And Graham was connected with Zuckerberg from one of Zuckerberg's classmates at Harvard's father, worked for the Washington Post and did investments, and introduced Zuckerberg to Donnie Graham, and they really hit it off. And Graham told me that it was the most exciting business he's seen in years, and he wanted to invest. He asked Zuckerberg if he'd be interested in the Washington Post taking a 10% stake in Facebook. And out in Silicon Valley, Parker and Matt Kohler, the other guy I mentioned, they didn't want to see that happen. They wanted a more traditional venture capital firm to be involved. So they brought in Excel, the venture capital firm, and they gave a bigger offer. Now, Zuckerberg had already essentially agreed with Graham to do that business. And he had a moral dilemma.
Right.
That's the way he described it. How could he break his word? Nothing was written to give the stake to Facebook. And Don Graham, if anyone knows him, this is totally in keeping with his character, he said that I release you from your moral dilemma. And he told me, well, he could have tried to match the bigger offer, but he knew that the venture capital firm would just then raise it again and again and again. But this really tortured Mark, and there was this one scene I write about where Kohler, it's a celebratory meal at the Village Pub in Woodside, and Jim Breyer of Excel opens a fancy bottle of wine. Of course, Zuckerberg can't drink it. He's not enough to drink. So he had a Sprite. But he goes back to the bathroom and doesn't come back. And Kohler just checks it. He's on the floor of the bathroom weeping. Yeah. He's so racked up about this dilemma. And I think that didn't happen much afterwards. I think that was sort of his crisis.
The moment. Yeah.
And maybe he took something from that. But in the big decision points that come later, I think he's a little more analytical and, if not cold-blooded, about the way he judges things.
How do you think things would have, I mean, it's counterfactual, how do you think things might have evolved if there was sort of a media culture, sort of post-ethos, if you will, Washington Post? I mean,
well, that's an interesting question. I think
it
could have taken a different direction. Certainly, as an advisor, if your funder was Don Graham, you might not have had such a focus on growth that Facebook developed.
Right. Because that does get into sort of the next topic, which is really growth. We're going to talk about the move fast and break things. People have heard about that? Yeah. So they moved real fast and they broke a lot of stuff. Let's talk a little bit about it. Where does it come from, and what do you think it really means in practice?
Well, where it came from is referred to the way they coded up Facebook. They use these fast new web tools, and it was a new paradigm. When people used to come to Facebook from Microsoft, they would report back to their friends at Microsoft that has versions that come out every 6 months, every year,
Right.
every 2 years. You're familiar with that.
Yeah, it's a big cycle.
Yeah, and at Facebook, they would have new versions every hour, maybe.
Right.
And so you would move fast with the code, and these tools enabled you to put up code really quickly. And if the thing crashed, okay, there's another version coming along. The next train's coming along. So that's no big deal. And for engineers, it was a badge of honor almost to crash the system. So move fast and break things started that way, but it came to be seen as the way Facebook operated in general. Putting out products that were on the edge, that if not, they might have worked in a technological sense, but they might have broken people's privacy models or their expectations. And if they push back, the idea would be, well, apologize for it and move on.
Well, there's a section where you write about the mission being connectivity, but then there's growth. And the way the company was organized, maybe you talk a little bit about the way when Sheryl Sandberg came into the company, which is a milestone moment as well, because she's a terrific leader and has taken immense responsibility for big facets of Facebook. So again, maybe drawing back to the earlier context about your earlier reflection on Mark and his decision-making, how do you think that structural split between product development and everything else, if you will, talk about that? There's a lot of interesting things that you write about that are really interesting if you're curious about how the company
I'll get to that split, but first about growth. You asked about first, which was an obsession relatively early on. That the important thing was to, if you're going to connect the world, you got to do it as fast as possible, and growth really became the top priority of Facebook, to get out there and get as many users as possible and keep those users. And the arrival of an executive called Chamath Palihapitiya.
I struggle with that one. I'm not good with vowels.
I hope I'm getting it right. I don't know if he's here. He would stand up and shout if I got it wrong if he's here. Very colorful guy who joined Facebook in 2007 and took a role of responsibility. He sort of filled in for the previous top lieutenant who fell out of favor after he advocated that Mark sell to Yahoo.
Got it.
And he didn't do a great job, Chamath, in that role. But when Sheryl arrived, he said, look, here's my Hail Mary. I want to start a team that's focused just on growth. And it's kind of like the Dirty Dozen, where he would pick the biggest and baddest people at Facebook to be on his team. They called it the Growth Circle. And he had this all-star team of kind of outcasts. And they pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable, to do anything and everything to build up growth. And I was proud that I got to learn some of the secrets that they used to push growth to the edge.
Talk about that. What are the secrets?
Well, one of them, there was something called dark profiles.
Okay.
And Mark wrote about that in the notebook. He outlined an idea for a dark profile, which would be a profile of someone on Facebook that you couldn't really see, but it existed anyway, of someone who hadn't signed up for Facebook. So it would be a secret that you didn't sign up for Facebook, but your profile would be in there, and they would draw on that information. And if you ever did sign up, it would be there waiting for you to fill in. So in the early days, if someone tagged you in a photo and you weren't on Facebook, that would go to this dark profile.
Really?
And what Chamath told me was that they would use it in other ways. That they would take out ads on Google for people's names. And of course, what everyone does is they search for their own name on Google. So you'd search for your name,
Sure.
and the ad would come up saying, here's, Daniel Lewin on Facebook. Wait a minute, I didn't sign up for Facebook. And you click on it, and there's their dark profile, and you might be tempted to go that extra mile and sign up and join Facebook.
And clean up the profile. Maybe,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So that was something, maybe not too kosher. They did a lot, but I think the masterpiece of the growth team is this product called People You May Know.
Right.
You all know the people you may know, right? Yeah. So it's a mystery. On your news feed, there's this row of people, and it says people you may know, and sometimes you see familiar faces, and sometimes you see people who are you're vaguely acquainted with, or you know who they are, and you wonder, how the heck did they know that there's this connection? And sometimes you see people who you don't know at all, but maybe later you learn that, well, there was a connection. And sometimes it gets really bizarre. There's been cases where people later learned that the faces shown to them on People You May Know were fellow patients of their psychiatrist. And good stuff, huh? And so I delved a little into, of course, some of the basic things they did, like scrape people's email, they saw the connection. Right. But it's like if you look at someone's profile, that might come up. Right. They know who you're close with. There's been a suspicion that physical location might have something to do with it. Right. There's all these elements that go into, this voodoo of people you may know. And it turned out to be a devastatingly effective tool to build up not only growth, but retention. Right. Because retention was just as important for the growth team. When someone new joins Facebook, they're in a vulnerable position because they don't have many friends right off the bat. Right. And if they don't have many friends, then there's no story is going to be posted to their news feed that comes from their friends. Right. So sometimes they would do things, they would make up stories. Right. Like Chamath called them fluff stories, the original fake news that would populate the news feed. But then the best way to do it would be to get friends in a hurry and to put those people up on People You May Know for users that Facebook figured out might be on your email connection or other connections. And
how did that scale internationally as well? Was that part of the strategy on growth? You talk a little bit about some of the country activities. Yeah. Well, for that, they would go into a new country. They might not know the language, but they would crowdsource the translation. And sometimes it would be in countries that really weren't used to the internet, are used to sharing information, and not used to telling the difference between legitimate news and made-up news. And Facebook couldn't track this because in some cases, like Myanmar, originally they didn't have anyone who could speak Burmese. So when posts came up that generated riots and caused deaths of people, Facebook couldn't stop that in advance. And they were warned about it, but they didn't do very much. And it wasn't until, some of these problems came up in 2012, but it wasn't until 2015 that Facebook actually translated its rule book for what was an acceptable post into Burmese. Got it. Fascinating. So where did growth report? How does that play out in the way the company grew over time? Because you do profile that, I think, nicely over the course of the book, sort of the structural alignment and sort of proximity. Well, the growth, Mark cared about growth. So, so you referred to the split with Sheryl and Mark. Right. So Sheryl comes on in 2008. What a great hire. Yeah. She's an experienced executive, ran Google's ad product, one of the most successful products in history. Yep.
She, knew how to build a culture, and I called her, it was like Wendy coming into the Lost Boys. She took out some of the dorm room, vestiges that were still around Facebook. And she built a sales organization, and she was in charge of pretty much everything Mark was not interested in. He wanted engineering, he wanted product, and Sandberg took the rest. And HR and lobbying, Washington office, policy, that was her domain. And the way that operated was almost like two separate companies. She was essentially the CEO of her domain, because she would be in contact with Mark. They'd meet at the beginning and end of every week. But generally, she liked it where she could take care of the problems in that organization, in Sheryl world. And that became a problem later on when those problems really needed CEO attention. One example of this is that security came under Sheryl's side. And the chief security officer reported to the general counsel, who reported to the policy guy, who reported to Sandberg. So there's all these steps there. And when all the trouble came, what the chief security officer had to report just did not get to Mark's side. As a matter of fact, he told me he never had a one-on-one with Mark Zuckerberg.
So this is
the chief security officer.
Yeah, it's interesting in large companies as they grow how the organizational structure sort of begets certain behaviors. Were there things that, as we get into the election, which will really be the next section, are there things that, again, with hindsight, as you followed on and bringing the book to close, did you feel like they were aware of the sort of the exclusivity of these domains and how it caused the issues? And do you have a sense, just to foreshadow?
Well, I don't think until after the election.
So let's just go right into the elections and talk about
they realized that and really until after they began to suffer the consequences of the election, when the hammer came down on them and the problems just blew up. Then they realized that that information flow should have been more free.
So let's talk about 2016 and the Facebook effect in the elections. It was a period, just on a personal note, where I was involved in working at Microsoft and had technology for both sides of the aisle. So it was all database work and machine learning work, but not the data. So I was pretty familiar with a lot of the things that you wrote about. And I think people who've been tracking what has gone on and led up to the issues in the 2016 election will recall Cambridge Analytica. We actually had a program on stage here a little while ago where we talked about that, people from The Guardian. And I think if you want to talk a little bit about the genesis of that, and in particular, it wasn't just like 2015 and 2016. So let's talk about where it started.
Okay. So Cambridge Analytica happened, I concluded, in 2010.
2010.
And that was when, remember, we talked about the platform. So the platform is one where the thousands of software developers would create programs.
They built programming interfaces.
And that program could be just a survey. To post a survey on there and get the results, you would sign up to be a developer, and they give you an API that you could tap into the information. And in 2010, Facebook released a new API for its platform. It was called Graph API V1, or the Open Graph. And they gave more information than ever to outside developers. At the time, they were introducing a feature called instant personalization. The idea is that you can go to someone else's website. One of the first three was Microsoft, actually, and bring your whole social network with you. And so the way that worked is when a user signed up for one of these apps, they would get a quick terms of service that they wouldn't look at, which would basically allow that developer to get all their information, but not just their information, but the profiles of all their friends.
Right.
So each user of Facebook has an average of 130 friends.
Right.
So you don't need giant numbers to get bigger and bigger numbers.
Yeah.
So I mentioned surveys. So some academics figured out this is like nirvana for research, because we could get huge numbers of people and learn about them, and what they do, and run these tests, run these on them, do the research. And one of the fellows who learned about this was a guy at Cambridge University named Alexander Kogan, and he did a survey. Paid people, from Amazon Turk or other places, like a pittance to fill out the survey, and from 200,000 people taking the survey, wound up with getting approximately 87 million profiles, which he then, and this was all, by the way, under Facebook's rules, totally kosher. What he did that was not kosher was take that information and sell it or license it to this company, Cambridge Analytica, which was a division of this UK military contractor. And this particular division was funded by the biggest funder of the extreme right in the United States. And Cambridge Analytica worked at first for Ted Cruz, and then later for Donald Trump.
Right.
And when this came out, actually it came out twice, but the first time there was an article in The Guardian in December 2015,
right.
And that's when Facebook first learned about it. And they did not act decisively to get ahead of this. They were very slow in even getting Cambridge Analytica to sign an affidavit saying they deleted this data. So a year and a half later, in April 2018, when The Guardian and the New York Times wrote about it, the thing blew up and became the biggest crisis in Facebook's history.
And did they ever audit?
No, they didn't audit, and they said, well, because the UK is having an investigation. It's kind of like Donald Trump's audit of his tax return. It's
right.
always good. The audit's always, something else is happening. When that's finished, we'll do the audit.
So these signals were coming pretty loudly, at least along the way. Do you have a sense from your research, and I don't remember the specifics in the book on this one, but I'm sure you do. Do you have a sense of where that information was flowing in, given the structure at the top of the company?
So generally there was three issues with the election. The first was, you mentioned Microsoft. They operate on both sides of the aisle. Facebook offered their services to help make the most of their advertising platform,
right.
to both sides.
Right.
The Clinton campaign wasn't interested. They didn't want to spend that much on Facebook. They didn't care to learn how to use it effectively.
Right.
And they turned down the offer of embedded Facebook employees who would be Democrats. Facebook offered to put Democrats in the Democratic campaign and Republicans in the Republican campaign. And the Republicans, run by this smart guy named Brad Parscale, they said, yeah, give us all of it. And they spent a fortune on Facebook. That was the center of their campaign. Mm-hmm. And they played Facebook platform like a Stradivarius.
Right.
And the people at Facebook were in awe at how well they used the platform. And they weren't too bothered by it, even if they were liberals, because they figured, there's no way that Trump's going to win anyway.
Right.
So that's problem one.
No, you write nicely about that. That all big companies deal with these issues where they've got their government affairs and they've got people from each side, given the two sides of the aisle, if you will, in the U.S. And they didn't want to be seen, you suggest, as being, pro one side
right.
or the other, and so they had a very high
right.
level.
Right. But problem two is what became known as fake news. So, the false articles. So the way Facebook, the news feed works, is the sensational stuff gets more traction than just boring true stuff. And so people figured out that if you post fallacious content and maybe even pretend that it came from a reliable source, is going to percolate wildly on the system. And most of it came from people trying to make money. And they figured out that for some reason, conservatives would engage more with this kind of content than liberals would. So, for instance, there was an article that came from the so-called Denver Guardian about an FBI agent was murdered who was looking into Hillary's emails. Totally not true. And the Denver Guardian was totally not true. There was no publication.
There is no Denver Guardian.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. They gave their address. It was a parking lot in Denver, and and that particular post, had about 40 times, some huge, much more engagement than the giant New York Times investigation of Trump's finances.
Right.
And a lot of it came from Macedonia, and they would monetize it. You click on that page, and they would get the ads. And then there was the third part, which was Russian involvement, because the Russians took advantage of the Facebook platform to run a disinformation campaign. Now, Facebook knew about problem two, the fake news.
Right.
And they couldn't miss it because it became an issue during the last few weeks of the campaign. Obama was talking about it and telling Facebook to do something about it during campaign stops for Hillary. But when they took meetings on it, and I write about one meeting in particular, they said, and the big mover in this conversation was the head of Facebook's Washington office, who was a lifelong Democrat, who some people around him, working around him, told me that he felt his job was to protect the Republicans. He said, we're going to leave it alone because we don't want to put our finger on the scale, and besides, the conservatives would say we're trying to tilt the election,
right,
towards Hillary.
Right.
Actually, it was a tilted playing field because of that fake news,
right,
and by doing something about it, they would be leveling it. But they did nothing.
Right. So they saw these things, but no action.
No action.
You document that in pretty good detail, and it's fascinating. Do you think there are lessons learned on that front?
Lots of
lessons learned?
Yeah, the lesson is that people are going to find out about those things you did, and you're not going to be able to do nothing again. And to be honest, I guess more for the Russian involvement, the people on Facebook were appalled when they finally realized what was happening. They weren't so appalled that they ran and were aggressive about informing the public about it, but when they saw the Russian content, some people told me they got sick to their stomach.
Yeah.
And but the fake news, they realized they were under pressure to do something about it, and they have addressed it in a number of ways. They have fact-checking. The first time they actually, would tell users about the result of their fact-checking, right? So if a fake news item got a certain amount of engagement, people complained about it, they had these fact-checkers to say, oh, this didn't happen, kind of like a Snopes kind of thing. Actually, the Snopes people were among the fact-checkers.
Right.
And then they put out a thing next to that content. They wouldn't take it down. They say, fact-checkers have determined this is disputed content. And that didn't work because people click on it more when they saw that notice.
Right.
So then they wound up doing other things like giving information about the source or presenting different accounts that were true based on the same subject.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. You call out, this is, I think, for some that haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but the level of sophistication that the Trump team deployed, and some of this has been profiled on National News, 60 Minutes, and other things, but they ran 170,000 plus variations of an ad on the same day.
Yeah, and they would find out what issue you engaged with.
Yeah.
And then if they concluded you weren't going to be voting for Trump, then they would switch because they had all this data, on people to figure out what buttons to push to get you to not vote.
Right. Right. Fascinating systems. Thank you. Great. So, given where we are now and sort of the aftermath of the election, what do you think that they have been doing well to help rebuild trust? I know they're investing, you document this, investing in a huge percentage of their headcount. that's associated with checking and coordinating things, both for the election, but also it broadened it a little bit beyond the election to the international front.
Well, there's all sorts of offensive content on Facebook, violent content, bullying, and they have this rule book. I describe how the rule book evolved from sort of an ad hoc, just a sheet of points that the customer support people use, to now an organization that has tens of thousands of people all over the world, looking at content all day and judging it, whether by the rules it's up or down. They've brought down fake news. They've addressed some of the issues about how the platform was attacked during the election. They've been more successful in subsequent elections, but the platform is still the platform, and they still don't take down fake news unless they know the account is inauthentic, and they have the extra problem now that they don't even fact check political ads. They let that proliferate, and they aggressively push that, as people pay for it, to people's news feeds. So while they've made progress, some of the basic problems still remain. And I think I wouldn't be surprised that there's still problems in 2020.
We have a little bit of time now to think about the sort of the global and the language issues. Would you talk a little bit about where they are on that? Because you've watched the progression on that front.
Sure.
Take into some of the audience questions.
Yeah, well, they've hired speakers of different languages. They're looking more aggressively for movements to spread violence, or oppression. They've taken down, I think it was 2018, they finally took down some Myanmar stuff. And it was like, what took you so long? So they're doing more, but the problems persist because Facebook is unprecedented in a scale. There's never been a social network like this, that it spreads so widely. And what I tried to do in the book is explain how Facebook evolved into something that was originally meant how you would keep up with your friends, with people you knew, with people on your social network, what Zuckerberg used to call the social graph, into something where people were getting their information from it in a wide sense. And which brought problems that were essentially insoluble. So Facebook painted itself into a corner where if they're too aggressive about taking down content, they're censors. They're not aggressive enough, they're circulating dangerous information. And so Facebook wants us to be sympathetic to them because they're in this dilemma, but I go back and say, hey, this is how you built this. You painted yourself into this corner.
Right. Yeah, there's the, I think it was probably Intel, had the fundamental philosophy that you have to design in quality, you can inspect it after the fact. So how do you see the sort of the evolution of the company, given the model that has been created? Do you have a sense that there will be changes in the structure in any particular way?
Well, the big change, and we haven't talked at all about Instagram and WhatsApp, and their messaging strategy. The big change is that Zuckerberg says there's going to be more of a focus on these messaging apps, which originally for Instagram and WhatsApp, after he bought them, he promised the founders that they would have some degree of autonomy, some independence, and that was one reason why they sold to him. Another reason was he threw an incredible amount of money at them and wouldn't let him out of his house till they agreed. But he basically forced out those founders by taking more control, and he sees this as sort of the spear which he's going to take Facebook into the future.
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the last area before we get into the audience questions, is the kind of the growth strategy and the acquisitions. So you mentioned WhatsApp and Instagram, and those are reasonably powerful additions.
Almost unreasonably powerful.
And therefore, talk a little bit about the implications.
Well, when he bought these, he said they're going to run them independently, and Instagram was run brilliantly by Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, and with the help of Facebook's resources, as Zuckerberg would increasingly point out in the last few years, they built it into something that's arguably a more valuable product than Blue, the main Facebook application. But with this new strategy, Zuckerberg essentially pushed out those founders by taking more control of it, by starving them of resources on their own. And the WhatsApp people who got much more money, Instagram was $1 billion, WhatsApp was $20 billion.
No.
And he was, again, got aggressive in taking that under his control. After a number of compromises, he made them, agree to. Like one of them was that originally it was thought that the data of WhatsApp users would not be merged with the Facebook's database.
Yeah, that was a fundamental commitment, I thought, right?
Yeah, and that was something that I think technically was a violation too, legally, and they got fined for that, and that was part of the recent settlement with the FTC when they decided, well, we're going to take those phone numbers, which was the identifier of WhatsApp, and merge them, with the Facebook world, because boy, better for the customers, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, it is a complicated situation that they've put
And I had an amazing interview with Brian Acton, one of the co-founders.
Talk about that.
Who bore his soul to me, really. He understands that, look, when you take billions of dollars, and he personally is worth $3 billion. He actually walked away from another billion, when he quit. And when you do that, you can't say, this is mine, I'm going to ignore what your boss says. And,
right.
Zuckerberg was essentially his boss. So he did it. He said, I sold out. But that didn't stop him from being...
Yeah, you do write nicely about that in the book.
Resentful of how it all played out.
Right. Very complicated. We've got some audience questions. Some curiosity about this one, about Facebook users. If they had a choice between personalized ads and context-based ads, which do you think most would choose?
Well, the deal which Facebook justifies this use of data, of deep dives into data to sell ads, is that they're going to give you more relevant ads to help you make better choices on what you buy or what events to go to. And there's something to that when you see, if you're a fan of some obscure band and a t-shirt comes up for that band that you never knew existed. It's a t-shirt you really want. They know this because they know a lot about you. And, in Facebook, one researcher, not in Facebook, but out of Facebook, found that with, I think, 15 likes, Facebook knows as much about you as your acquaintances.
Closest friends, yeah.
And with 30 likes, like a good friend, and then 100 likes with a family member, and 300 likes, Facebook will know as much about you or more than your spouse, right? So they can really pinpoint you there. So boy, they can really sell you the products you want. But when the ads are used not to serve you what you want, but to manipulate you into doing something that you don't want, that's not such a great deal, is it, to give away your data? You're giving away your data for people to, make you not vote, for instance.
There you go. So some questions about Mark's personality, because so much of it comes across in the book. Question about whether you think his personality has changed, his sort of social ability since starting a family.
Very, very smart guy. So he has achieved a level of sociability, better communication skills. When I interview him for the book, and with other journalists too, but I think I got to a pretty high degree of candor, as close as he gets. But he's a much more communicative person. He's got a family.
Yep.
He's run this big company, so he has matured. But again, every so often, Exeter, you see that in
Behavior.
exercising his power, he actually constructed the company. This is part of the Sean Parker influence, to own, I think, 54% of the voting stock.
Voting shares, right.
So no one could overrule him. The board of directors can't even overrule him.
Right.
And so he's got total command of the company. And about a year ago, he announced to his management team that from then on, he was going to be no longer a peacetime CEO, but a wartime CEO.
Right.
I don't think he was ever a peacetime CEO, but the wartime CEO, and this is the terminology that Ben Horowitz wrote up first in a blog and then his book. But that meant that he might not consult as much with people before making the decision that he makes.
Got it.
So,
Cut to the chase.
Yeah.
Speaking of control and companies, this is a good question from the audience, and I didn't notice it in the book. You make no reference to the investments from Uri Milner into the company. Did you have any insight in your research to that and the implications?
Well, I mean, it's not so much a Facebook specific thing. I don't think it had an influence on the company. You look at the book, you think, well, something in there. How did he miss that? But there's plenty I actually couldn't get in there.
No doubt, right.
That book.
And just for those, Uri Milner happens to be a Russian and invested a lot in a lot of the early social startup companies.
So it was a relatively late stage investment. I do talk about the Microsoft investment.
Right.
When they invested $240 million for 1.6% of the company in 2007, it was regarded by some people as lunatic.
Right.
Because, how could Facebook be worth $15 billion, which was the valuation at that level? And even as smart a person as Kara Swisher said that this is ridiculous, this dumb money chasing Facebook, which compared to Google is a lemonade stand.
Right, yeah.
And then that stake became worth $8 billion, by the way.
I know, I was there.
And some of that fell to you, the analyst?
No, not in the least.
No cut.
Not in the least, not in the least. But I was spending time in startup land and working with the venture community, and was at that first API conference and other things. That's where I met Mark. And there was clearly something there. No one knew it was going to be this. And I don't think, with all deference to everything that you appropriately critique in the book, the cat got out of the bag real fast. It's really hard to imagine they could have done things all that much better because it was just escalating so quickly. And the growth was clearly the mantra. So there's a question about it's an interesting one, given the oversight and the lack, in some cases, of adherence to the regulations and the mandates or the edicts.
Yeah. We've got two, FTC.
Yeah, there's two FTC. So if they were going to break things up, what do you think might happen? This is a speculative question.
Well, I mean, it's not a.
How might
it's not a secret that basically. They're under investigation by the Department of Justice, the FTC, specifically look, and every attorney general in every state, basically, I think 47.
Right.
And European, oversight. And they focus on one solution, one, remedy would be making Facebook split off Instagram and WhatsApp from the company being entities. Now, again, from Microsoft, we know that they had their antitrust trial, and they had a ruling. They had to break their stuff apart. And what happened was that some other administration came and made a deal. But these things take years. So one other company that Zuckerberg bought, we didn't talk about, was Oculus.
Right.
And he bought it because he thought in 10 years that might be the next platform. So I think probably by the time we're all walking around with headsets,
Right.
would be the time that they manage to break up Facebook, if they do, because these things go very slow.
Yeah, they do.
And what'll happen is that, as with Microsoft, it'll have an effect on Facebook, because Facebook won't be able to buy the next Instagram. There's no way Facebook could ever buy TikTok under the current regulatory regime.
Right. Yeah, no, those things are absolutely true. They change the behavior and the patterns. Some questions about the correlation between the social network. We didn't talk about that, although it's something we discussed and you reference a little bit in the book. But what is the sort of your take on the movie, and sort of Mark, and we've talked to him about it.
Yeah.
What's his take on that, and what did you see?
It's a terrific movie.
Yeah, I thought it was terrific too.
Yeah, but not always adhering to the facts. Zuckerberg himself says, points out that, well, they said I created Facebook to get girls, when in fact I had a girlfriend. She's now my wife. Like the whole time. So that wasn't my motivation. He did note that they got the layout of his dorm room right, and what he wore. That's not hard to guess. You always see him in the hoodie, right? But he not pleased by the movie. And Sheryl Sandberg, when she saw a screening, she yelled at Aaron Sorkin, "How could you do this to him?"
Yeah.
So it was.
It's a movie.
Well, Zuckerberg was traumatized, not just by the movie, but from the lawsuits that are documented in the movie, and those really happened. We didn't talk about the
Winklevoss.
Yeah, the classmates that.
Yeah, talk about that. That's
I thought originally, I wouldn't get too much into it. I didn't give a whole lot of space to it, but I did conclude that he didn't steal the idea for Facebook from the Connect You guys, the Winklevoss twins. He did drag his feet, and it was during a period of a couple months.
Yeah.
And he said that he would code up their product for them.
Right.
And and he wrote in an instant message exactly that what he was doing to someone. And he wrote a series of instant messages around that time that were, in retrospect, pretty damaging.
Right.
And he was really embarrassed when those things came out in the press. They got leaked from the lawsuit into the press, and some of them in Business Insider. And that had a big impact on him. That's why he destroyed that notebook that where I saw pages of it. And that's why, in part, he told me, and this really surprised me, he's pursuing this privacy-focused vision to encrypt all these messaging services, so that wouldn't happen to his customers.
Well, that's sort of a fascinating situation given where we are today. Do you have a sense, this is again a future thing related to where we are in the public sphere and the election and democracy, because these social networks, you talked about a number of them. We didn't talk, one question from the audience about Google's social network, and there's really no context on that.
Well, I talked a little bit about that, about Google Plus and how Zuckerberg rallied the troops around it, and questions whether it was really a threat. But a little before then, I didn't write about this much. I actually wrote about it in the Google book. Google wanted to create this product called Open Social, where your information, your social profile could be fungible. You could take it from one place to another, and Facebook killed that by ignoring it. So if they weren't part of it, that Open Social was a non-starter.
So I had some summarizing questions, and then we're going to get into the final one-word topic. But I'm curious about your sense of the greater benefits of social networking on society. There are certainly some closing comments you make in the book about trust and the implications of social networks and trust, and it really does center around the topic of money, because money, in a word, is trust. There's something behind it, and Facebook did begin and instigate this consortia around Levy.
Right, and they just pulled back on it.
They pulled back on it. So, as you look at the situation, And clearly, it is an entity like Facebook or others that have these broad networks that would be considering these kinds of things. Do you have a sense of sort of the lasting impact of the social network, Facebook?
Well, look, almost 3 billion people use Facebook, the Facebook family. Facebook itself, the Blue app, over 2.5 billion people. A sizable portion of the world. You have to think that people are getting something out of it.
Right.
People here, I'm sure most of you are on Facebook. I'm sure some of you might have deleted Facebook, but like thought you deleted Facebook.
How many people have a Facebook account? Just, I'm curious, just to hands up. See, yeah, it's 90%.
So, younger people, they say, well, I may not be on Facebook. They're on Instagram.
Right.
So there's value there.
Right.
In recent years, Zuckerberg's talked about community as a focus. He even changed the mission to include community. And there are a number of these, what he calls meaningful groups, the cancer survivors and, black entrepreneurs and other.
Yeah, the new advertising campaigns are very focused.
And they do exist, and people do use it to keep in touch with folks. Anyone, on your birthday, you get those nice messages there. So there's plenty there. What Facebook didn't take into account soon enough, you mentioned, in the early days they couldn't have anticipated this, but they've had years to look at the impact of what they do and and get ahead of what they do, where they didn't consider the consequences of the times that it isn't healthy, that it is toxic, and unlike early Facebook, where if something goes wrong, it might put you in an awkward social situation. You have things now where people get bullied, where there is violence caused. So it's not like a bumper car accident; it's more like a plane crash.
Right.
And you have to take more care to avoid that from happening. In some areas, they've been successful. They're pretty successful using artificial intelligence to get down terrorist content. But in other things like hate speech, they just have like a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you think about the broad implications of technology and networks in general that cross political and social, geopolitical borders, basically. Do you think there is a way for a U.S.-centric company like that to handle things on a global basis well?
Well, it's difficult because Facebook is an American company, and the values are essentially American values.
Right.
And they have one rule book for the whole globe.
Right.
And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't work so well.
Right.
I think it's a technology that was going to happen with or without Mark Zuckerberg.
Right.
And maybe without Facebook, we would have seen some of those problems. So, in a way, Facebook stepped into the circle, and we all judge it. Certainly,
right.
I told the story that you'll make your judgments. I tried not to be judgmental in the book, but let the facts drive the narrative, and told it as a story. This happened to be the company that grabbed this concept and spread it throughout the globe. So I think it's fair to take that assessment and tell that story so you folks can make your own judgments about how well they did compared to how well they could have done.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good closing comment. It is an extraordinary moment in time as a result of the scale that was created, and now with Stephen's book, the ability to look back and understand the personal motivations, because companies, especially companies that have the ability to scale so quickly, and ones that are centrally controlled with voting shares in one person's hands. The fact is that you've done an extraordinary job of looking at historical context, interleaving the time-based decisions that were made
And I also got in
Yeah.
the fact that, in his early appearances in public, this PR person blew dry his armpits so he wouldn't sweat so much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Let's not forget that.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's complicated. There you go. So we have a tradition here at CHM, and it's associated with one word, and you probably noticed it in the hallway on the way in. And we asked all of our guests to write down one word of advice to an aspiring entrepreneur or an innovator of some sort to help guide them on their career. And we'll ask you to do that right now, Stephen. If you'd share your one word, we've got your card right here that you could hold
Where's
up.
the card? Oh, there we go.
And give us just a little story about why that's your one word.
Sure. So here's my word.
Imagine that.
I'm a journalist, and that's the bedrock of what I do.
Yeah.
I learned that any story I write, I have to approach with smothering my preconceptions, killing them and dead, and opening myself up to what the truth is and what I'm doing. And sometimes it takes a while. It took 3 years here to uncover what I felt was the truth about Facebook and let that truth create my narrative. And not write a polemic, but write a story based on the zillions and zillions of facts I wrote. And I feel we're at a time where truth is under assault, and that even if it's not popular, even if it doesn't get as much engagement on Facebook, truth is our ballast. We need it more than ever. And there's a lot of journalists who do pursue it, thank God, and it's important. And I think for entrepreneurs, people in business, they have to be cognizant of what truth is. They can't let numbers, their goals of the numbers, or their fantasies of how well things are doing, drive what the company is. They have to hear the bad news. And the great entrepreneurs always say, I have to hear the bad news.
Absolutely.
Don't keep that bottled up. And I think Facebook, for too long, ignored some of the truths that were happening on its platform. And that led it to some of the problems that they have now. So, please, truth to all of you.
Yeah, thank you for what you do, Stephen.